Thank you to everyone calling in. We are super excited to dive into this topic of gratitude with you all today. This is the second webinar that we've hosted for the Gratitude in the Workplace Challenge. We're currently in the ideas phase of the challenge, which means that we are accepting ideas on the platform, and that deadline is until October 25th. So if you have not already, we encourage you to log on potentially right after this webinar and post an idea to our platform that addresses the question of how might we inspire more expressions and experiences of gratitude in the workplace. I'm Lauren Ito. I am the community manager for this challenge, and we are joined by a very special guest today that will be sharing out his work in the gratitude space and dive a little bit deeper into this topic. So Ryan Fehr is an associate professor of management at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business. He's done a lot of research, which include positive organizational scholarship, ethics and morality, and leadership. He received his PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Maryland and has been published in outlets such as the Academy of Management Review, the Journal of Applied Psychology, and received Best Paper awards from the Academy of Management. So Ryan, I will now hand it over to you, and we're super excited to share for the share that you're about to provide for us. A few logistics right before we hand it over is Hannah, who you see in the chat box, will be moderating the conversation for us. We also will have a Q&A following Ryan's share. So we encourage you to, as questions come up, feel free to type them in that chat box. If you are logging in via your computer, you will see the option for chat appear at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to engage there, and we'll be curating some questions live and answering them following Ryan's share. So I'll turn it over to you, Ryan, and thank you again for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks everybody who's calling in for listening today. So usually I teach ethics to MBA students, and when I'm not in the classroom, I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to build more positive organizations. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about how to build more forgiving organizations, more ethical organizations. And recently I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how to build a more grateful workplace. And I've been really amazed to see sort of the powerful effect that gratitude can have on employees and individual organizations, and also on organizations' overall success. So today I hope to do a few different things. The first thing I want to talk a little bit about is why gratitude. So what are some of the problems that we're currently facing in organizations that gratitude can provide a solution to and that gratitude can help with? Then the second thing that I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the rules for a grateful workplace. So these are specific actionable things that I think we can do and need to do if we really are serious about bringing gratitude into work and about making the workplace a more grateful environment. The third thing I want to do then is talk a little bit about evidence that we already have for the benefits of gratitude in organizations. And so I really believe that if we want to move this forward, this sort of idea of building more grateful workplaces, one of the key things we have to do is demonstrate that it has actionable and positive effects in organizations that can really get leadership and other groups on board. And then the final thing I'm going to do is just talk through a few obstacles that sometimes come up that people talk about in terms of concerns they have for whether gratitude can be brought into the workplace successfully. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the obstacles that I've heard come up a few different times and some ways that I believe we can handle that. So starting with why gratitude, there are 3 challenges that I think a lot of workplaces face today that gratitude can really be a helpful solution to. The first thing is that I worry that oftentimes work is too competitive. So of course, competition is inherent to work in general, but I worry about what happens when we start using this competitive lens in all of our workplace interactions. So what happens when we start viewing all of our relationships with our coworkers as competitive? What happens when we start viewing all of our relationships with our managers, our followers, and other stakeholders like customers? What happens when we view those relationships as too competitive? The second thing that I worry about, and I actually think that this is even more important, is that work has become perhaps a bit too transactional. And so employees are hesitant to do favors for each other. They're hesitant to trust each other, to think in the long term. And this bias toward being transactional that we think about our relationships. So it's going to increase the stress that we feel. It's going to reduce the sense of support that employees feel when they interact with each other, the sense that their organization supports them. And ultimately, I worry that it's going to hinder performance and increase the likelihood of turnover in our organizations. And the last problem that I think we're facing is that we become too distracted. So we have so many different duties and we're constantly being pulled in 20 different directions. We're always multitasking and moving from one issue to the next that we never really take time to see the big picture. And I think that if we did zoom out and see the big picture about the positive role that work can play in our lives, that we would be better off for it. And so when we think about these issues of often the fact that work is too competitive, that it's too transactional, that it's too distracting, I think that bringing gratitude into the workplace can be a really good solution to all of these challenges, can help shift us away from this overly competitive environment, can shift us away from this overly transactional environment, and can shift us away from this tendency to be distracted by all the little things that are going on in our organizations. And so that's why I believe that gratitude is so important and something that we really need to build up in organizations. So I'm going to jump into next are some rules for a grateful workplace. And so these are things that I believe that organizations can and should do in their effort to build more gratitude at work. And so the first thing, my first rule is that we need to build a gratitude habit in organizations. So gratitude begins as an individual emotion. It's a feeling of appreciation that we have in response to an experience that's beneficial to us, but's caused by something that's outside. And positive emotions are great. So they have all sorts of positive effects for our well-being and for our experiences at work. However, I don't believe that gratitude ends there. And I think that by only thinking about gratitude as an emotion that we only feel on occasion, that we're actually limiting its power in organizations. And so instead, I argue that it's helpful to think about gratitude as a habit, as a stable tendency to feel grateful within a particular context and specifically at work, as something that we experience consistently and persistently at work. And the idea goes something like this. We experience lots of individual gratitude episodes at work, but they don't happen in isolation. So what happens is over time, we begin to associate the notion of gratitude with the notion of work. In other words, we become primed to think about gratitude within the context of work. And so you can just think for a minute that you tend to experience certain emotions. You're primed to experience certain emotions in different organizational contexts or other contexts. So for instance, you might feel primed. You might tend to feel happy in some relationship interactions. You might tend to feel happy when you're at home and you're hanging out with your family. On the other hand, you might tend to feel angry in some context. So perhaps as soon as you get in your car and you know you're about to be in the commuting context, that makes you feel a bit angry. Well, in that same way, just as some contexts make us feel angry, some contexts make us feel happy, work can be a context where we're primed to feel certain emotions. And one of those emotions can be gratitude. And I think that once we prime people to feel gratitude at work, once gratitude becomes a habit, something that we feel at work, there are a few things that happen. Number one, you're going to become more attentive to small acts of kindness in your everyday experiences. So if somebody helps you just a little bit, normally you might not have paid too much attention to it, but all of a sudden, because you're primed to think about workplace in terms of gratitude, then you're going to start feeling more gratitude in that way. The other thing that might happen, a second thing that might happen, is that you begin to interpret ambiguous events with gratitude. So if another employee helps you in a transactional environment, if you're not primed to think about gratitude at work, if it's not a habit, you might simply view that help as a natural transaction, part of the exchange relationships at work. But if you're primed to feel gratitude, all of a sudden you start seeing that interaction through a more appreciative lens. And then the last thing that I think can happen with this gratitude habit is that you're more likely to use past gratitude events and use them as a lens to shape how you see things. So for instance, when you're interacting with your close colleagues, you might be reminded of things they've done for you in the past, and then all of a sudden you're viewing that relationship through a more appreciative lens. And this gratitude habit, I think what it does over time is it creates a gratitude spiral. So you start feeling more gratitude at work, you start seeing these gratitude experiences, and it's self-reinforcing. And then the other thing that I think can happen over time, and what I think is the ultimate goal, is that then it moves from a habit that an individual faces to part of an organization's entire culture. So then we have this third level, this cultural level, where this persistent gratitude is shared by all of the members of an organization. And so we think about the organizational culture, the culture and climate of that organization. One of the things we think about is this is an organization where people feel and express gratitude. And we know from a lot of organizational research that organizational culture has all sorts of lasting effects within the organization. So for instance, one of the strongest predictors of whether people act ethically or unethically at work is whether there's culture within that organization. Point where we have a grateful culture, I believe that all sorts of positive things can result. So the first rule is to try to build this gratitude habit, ultimately getting to a grateful organizational culture. And the second rule is that we want to think about all of the different sources that we can draw gratitude from. And then there's some specific organizational practices that align with these sources of gratitude. So the first source of gratitude, the one that we typically tend to think of, is others help us. And I'll just share two quotes from some interviews that I've done asking people why and when they feel gratitude at work. So in this first quote, someone said, "At my current job, I went through a bad time with when my elderly mother was ill. I needed to work very odd hours and take several days off to care for her. My manager pretty much told me to do whatever I needed to take care of her, and I was able to do that, and I really appreciated my boss working with me in that way." Another example, I remember a time when I came into work after I had surgery on my arm. Thus, my arm was in a sling and it inhibited my ability to do my work, slowed me down because my arm, I wasn't able to use it. So my boss voluntarily came in, suggested to me that I only work half days until the sling came off because he knew it was taking a lot of time and energy for me to function. So we know that the first source of gratitude is when others help us. And there are a couple of organizational practices that we can do to really facilitate that. The first one, and a good starting point, is appreciation programs. So Jane Dutton, she's at the University of Michigan, and her colleagues conceptualize formal appreciation programs as occasions when organizations have planned opportunities to endow individuals with expressions of what they call positive affirmation. So common examples here might include retirement events, celebrations of product launches, or something like that. And appreciation programs are a really good first step in increasing gratitude at work. First, they're really good because they create rituals around gratitude expression. And so appreciation programs help organizations build a culture where gratitude is encouraged and where gratitude is supported. So what happens with an appreciation program is employees see top management expressing gratitude, and then they learn from that, that's something that the organization encourages. Additionally, appreciation programs are helpful because they help employees see the roles that many different people play in the organization's success. So all of a sudden they're realizing, wow, there really are all of these different pieces of the puzzle that come together, and then they'll start feeling more gratitude for all of those pieces of the puzzle as well. Appreciation programs work best when they focus on praising employees and teams for their effort and perseverance. Conversely, what you want to be careful with appreciation programs is that you don't single out one employee's performance at the expense of others, such as rewarding a top sales associate at a car dealership. That can create more of a competitive environment. So you want to focus on teams, you want to focus on effort and perseverance, and building your appreciation programs around those. The other thing that we can do with this first source of helping draw attention to others helping us is gratitude expression interventions. So right now, I'm actually running a very large gratitude expression intervention with factory employees in China. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to draw attention to the ways in which employees help each other by setting aside time each week when employees have the opportunity to express gratitude to each other. A lot of repetitive work here, but they really believe that this gratitude expression, explicitly talking about it, can really help bring employees together. And so we've only just started this project, but it's a month-long project, and we're optimistic that this gratitude expression can be really effective. So this first source of gratitude, others helping us, that's the one that we tend to think of when we think of gratitude in organizations. But it's important to recognize that there are a lot of other things that people can feel grateful for. And the second source, and this actually often comes up even more often than others helping us, is that employees feel grateful for the opportunities that work provides them to help others within the organization. So oftentimes we think of gratitude as something that you only experience when someone gives you something. We think about gratitude as something that you experience when you get a gift or help from others, but there's so much more that employees can feel grateful for. In fact, in one study with healthcare professionals, some researchers found that one of the biggest sources of gratitude at work was when those healthcare professionals were successful at helping others, especially their patients. Because when we have these opportunities to help others, it infuses our lives with meaning, it improves our sense of self-worth, and in my interviews and in others, it comes up time and time again as something that employees feel deeply grateful for. So sharing a few quotes from my interviews here, one interviewee said, "I felt grateful when I saw the results of work come to fruition, when it was reinforced to me that what we do matters and is respected and used in the company." Another interviewee said, "I felt gratitude when I was doing my normal job protecting the public." So this was a police officer, and the individual said, "I stopped to see if a person sitting in his car needed help, and he told me that he had help on the way, but out of 6 police cars that passed by, I was the only one to stop and check." And it felt really good to know that I could have this positive impact, and the person said that it felt good knowing that there were still good officers on the road. The last example here from another interviewee says, "I worked at a college with a team where I was the lowest ranked, but my input and involvement were as important as others. My boss made me feel respected and let me know that I was a vital member of the group, and I was extremely grateful to work with that individual and to know that I was having an impact." So gratitude comes not just from helping others, but from our capacity, not just from others that help us, but from our capacity to help others. And there are 2 organizational systems that we can use here to try to help increase this focus on our ability to help others. The first is beneficiary contact. So there's a pretty famous study that was done a few years ago by Adam Grant. He's the author of books like Give and Take and Originals. And he did a study with call center employees where he randomly assigned some of the call center employees, this was at in a college where they were calling up people to get money for scholarships. And so he randomly assigned some of these employees to have a direct conversation with the people who were benefiting from their work. So these were the people who were receiving the scholarships that these call center employees were calling people to get money for. And he found that that direct contact with these beneficiaries dramatically increased their persistence, dramatically all impact that they're having on others. Sometimes with work, it's difficult to see the positive impacts of our work, but if we can structure work a little bit differently and try to have some more direct interactions with the people who benefit from our work, then this can be really useful. The other program is, sometimes, no matter how hard we try, it's difficult to really see who we're positively impacting through our work. But Jessica Rodell, who's a professor at the University of Georgia, and some of her colleagues have shown that volunteer programs that are started by organizations can become a tremendous source of pride and positive impact for employees. So this can become a great way through which employees feel like their work enables them to have a positive impact on others. And so past research has shown that these volunteer programs really directly increase the amount of pride that employees feel for working for their organizations. In turn, it increases the amount of commitment that they feel to the company. It increases their engagement at work. And similarly, I think this can be really beneficial to gratitude because, again, what we're doing is we're providing employees with another source of gratitude. So we're allowing work to be a path through which employees can have this positive impact that we know is so central to people's feelings of self-esteem and self-worth. And the third source of gratitude that I think we can focus on is in building our skills. So we have our first two here. We have that we feel gratitude when others help us, and gratitude when we have the capacity to help others. But beyond receiving and giving help, one of the things that I've again found in interviews is that people often express gratitude for the fact that work allows them to develop their skills. So if we think about the things that work provides employees that there's a potential to feel gratitude for, this is one of the big ones. When we're at work, we develop new skills, we become more competent in areas that are more fulfilled. And to the extent that we can structure work to try to draw attention to that capacity of work to help us develop our skills, then that can be a really valuable source of gratitude as well. And so the first thing that we can do here in terms of practices is we can focus on developmental feedback. So developmental feedback refers to feedback that focuses on enabling employees to learn and to practice new skills. And so in interviews, I found that people experience a lot of gratitude when they're allowed to go to new training seminars that enable them to develop new skills. A number of teachers have talked about the gratitude they feel when they're able to develop their skills that help them be more effective instructors. One interviewee working for a cell phone company said that she had a really good boss who encouraged her to learn new skills, gave her a few books that were really useful for developing those skills, and that's something she still remembers to this day. So developmental feedback can be a really helpful way to draw attention to these skills because you're coaching employees through this process of becoming more competent employees. The other thing that I'm a big fan of is cross-training. Oftentimes we become very siloed in organizations and we can feel like we're just doing the same thing every day and we're not really developing new skills. Cross-training has already been shown to be surprisingly effective in terms of a variety of positive outcomes in organizations. So for instance, one thing it does is it really helps solidify relationships across an organization because you can see what other people are doing that you normally wouldn't interact with. But directly here, cross-training can help us, again, develop these new skills, and all of a sudden we can become grateful because we're learning all of these new things at work. So this is the second rule, is drawing from all of these sources, realizing that gratitude isn't just when somebody helps us and gives us a gift or helps us with an assignment. It also comes from these other sources as well. And there are these specific actionable organizational practices that are effective. So the third rule for building more grateful organizations is we want to be careful to guard against negative emotions. And I'll just look at 3 of these negative emotions here. So the first negative emotion that we should be worried about is envy. People really like it when you express gratitude to them. The problem with that is what happens when, for instance, a leader expresses gratitude to one employee but not another, and another employee sees that they're not receiving that same gratitude. A few of my PhD students and I recently did a series of lab studies on this exact question. And so we had a Confederate go into the lab who had this leadership role. And after 2 participants engaged in a collaborative performance exercise, the leader visibly expressed gratitude to one, but not the other. And what happened surprised me in terms of its magnitudes. Of course, the person who wasn't thanked felt worse than they would have felt if they were thanked, but they actually felt worse than people where nobody was thanked at all. So in other words, it was worse for the well-being of that employee. It was worse for their willingness to collaborate with anybody else. To see somebody else receive gratitude and have them not receive gratitude than to have nobody receive gratitude at all. So when we're thinking about expressing gratitude in organizations, we need to, we can get some very negative effects. The second thing that we need to worry about is pride. And so if we constantly have, especially for instance with appreciation programs, just thanking people over and over again, we risk instilling hubristic pride to the point of almost narcissism. And excessive pride is dangerous. So we know that excessive pride makes people more self-focused, We know that more narcissistic employees, when they're leaders, for instance, they tend to become overly self-confident. They tend to be less sensitive to employees' needs. There tends to be a lot more conflict. And so to avoid this risk of excessive pride, I argue that it's important to cultivate humility in employees. And so we need to ensure that they don't just receive gratitude, but also express it. And an institutionalized system where everybody is both receiving and expressing gratitude, where gratitude is bi-directional. And so people can see how everybody matters in ensuring the success of the organization can really help dealing with this problem. And the final risk here is anger. And I think a great analogy here is when organizations initiate environmental initiatives and how customers sometimes react. So customers will often feel angry when they view a company's environmental initiatives as insincere, when they feel like the company is just trying to trick them into buying more products or to avoid negative press. And so in these situations, I tell my students in my MBA classes that organizations can do two things to demonstrate their sincerity: transparency and consistency. Transparency about what they're doing and why, and consistency in terms of what they actually do and their motives. And I think these same principles for good environmental efforts applies to gratitude initiatives as well. So some employees will inevitably and understandably be cynical about your motives if you try to instill gratitude in the organization. But you can address that cynicism and the potential anger first by being transparent, by telling them why you're instituting this system. And that might involve some honest talk about the problems you're facing as an organization. And second, use appreciation program one time a year and call it a day. You can't just run a single gratitude expression intervention if employees have nothing to be grateful for. You need to be sure that you're trying to create a positive experience overall for employees, and that the notion of gratitude is aligned with everything else that's going on in the organization, that it's aligned with programs that show respect for employees, and that, again, really try to create a positive environment that makes it easy to feel gratitude, and that can help deal with some of that backlash. Then the next thing that I wanted to mention is some of the benefits that gratitude can have for organizations. And there are a lot of them. I'm going to focus in particular on 4 of them. The first one is helping behavior. Sometimes in organizational contexts, we call this organizational citizenship behavior. And this is a central consequence of gratitude. And this helping behavior can be directed toward other individuals, or it can be directed toward the organization. For example, individual-directed OCBs or helping behaviors include helping others when they've been absent, staying late at work to help a colleague, or making newcomers feel welcome. Organization-directed OCBs include things like defending an organization from outsiders, helping improve an organization's image, or protecting the organization from negative press or other potential problems. And so there's actually been a few diary studies in organizations, diary studies where you follow employees every single day over the course of a few weeks, that have shown that the more gratitude that somebody feels on a given day, the more likely they are to help their colleagues. And something that's not just somebody helps me and I help them back. What gratitude does is it creates an overall helping mentality. And so it's very much an instance where people will pay it forward. And so they're feeling gratitude, somebody helps them, etc. And then they start helping other people throughout the organization. And so in this way, gratitude can be really powerful because it really is something that can spread and be contagious throughout the organization. Another study showed that gratitude increases the quality of customer interactions via increased helping behavior. So when employees feel grateful, they're more helpful toward customers. That has a direct impact on customer satisfaction. And recently I did a diary study looking at the reverse. And so I tracked about 200 employees again over the course of 2 weeks. And I found that gratitude also acts as a buffer against unhelpful behavior or deviant behaviors. So things like actively sabotaging other employees, slacking off at work, things like that. So gratitude not only helps us be more pro-social at work, it reduces our tendencies to be anti-social at work. And so it kind of helps with helping behavior on both sides of the coin. The next thing that gratitude can be really helpful with is what's called communal exchange norms. So exchange-based norms, non-communal norms, as the name implies, are very transactional. So this is an idea of I do something for you do something for me, and then I do something immediately to pay you back. And this is this transactional kind of context where we tend to think of when we think of workplace relationships. Communal norms, in contrast, are much more focused on the long term. So here you can think about a relationship with a friend. So if you help out a friend, you don't immediately expect him or her to pay you back equally. Types of relationships at work. We're no longer thinking about short-term exchanges. Instead, we're thinking about the long term. We have trust. We view people at work as friends, as people that we can rely on. And so work can be really helpful. And gratitude can be really helpful in building these communal exchange norms. The third positive consequence we can get here is organizational resilience. So organizations face so many challenges, from competitive pressures in the marketplace, economic downturns, new customer demands, new regulations. Resilient organizations, organizations with a lot of resilience, are those that can thrive in the face of adversity. And interestingly, research suggests that resilience is most likely to emerge in an organization when you have, number one, high quality relationships, number two, when employees have growth opportunities, and C, when employees trust each other. And so if we look at each of those antecedents of resilience in turn, we know that gratitude helps us build more high quality committed relationships. We know that one aspect of gratitude is feeling grateful for growth opportunities within the organization. And then we know that trust is a central part of high quality relationships. When we have strong relationships, when we have committed relationships, they tend to be characterized by trust. And so that suggests that gratitude can be a really good way to build resilience at the organizational level and help it deal with really challenging times. And so there's one study, for instance, that showed that gratitude helps us feel more embedded in our organizations, and that sense of embeddedness and dedication to the organization makes us less likely to leave. So gratitude has a relationship with turnover and can ensure that we stay in the organization over time. And the final consequence of gratitude that I wanted to mention is social impact. Sometimes we call this corporate social responsibility. So this is when organizations try to have a positive impact on external stakeholders, and organizations differ widely in their social responsibility. I live in Seattle, and just for instance, Microsoft and Starbucks are both really well known for their attentiveness to social responsibility. So Starbucks, for instance, spends a lot of time ensuring that it treats its suppliers with respect. It spends a lot of time with community engagement, again, trying to be a socially responsible organization. And so this is interesting because it's really kind of where the rubber hits the road in terms of how gratitude can really help to transcend the boundaries of the organization, help the organization itself have a broader impact. So gratitude helps us be more pro-social, but again, it's not just a reciprocal type of pro-sociality. It helps us feel more pro-social in general. And so once we get gratitude at the organizational culture level, all of a sudden what we're going to have is we're going to have all of these employees and this culture of helping in the organization, and it's going to propel forward this desire for social impact, to be more socially responsible. And so this is really the highest level at which gratitude can impact not just people within the organization, but even outside of it. So the last thing that I mentioned just briefly is three obstacles that I think are often mentioned, and that we can, and some ways in which we can overcome them in our path to try to build a more grateful workplace. So the first one is the obstacle that employees are increasingly isolated. So telecommuting is great for a lot of reasons. Virtual work is great for a lot of reasons. But if employees aren't interacting with each other, opportunities for gratitude and for building really strong relationships just aren't there. And so one thing that organizations can do to deal with this problem of isolation is to try to build in systems that ensure at least some level of interaction. So I like to think about something like telecommuting as a practice where you need to find the right balance. perhaps we don't want to have some flexibility, we can find something in the middle. So for instance, if we have core hours where employees are at work and they have opportunities to interact with each other, that can help provide opportunities for gratitude and help ensure that employees feel connected to the organization. Similarly, we can develop rituals, weekly or annual, that bring employees together. And so that can ensure that the employees are all in the same place, again, that they're having those opportunities to interact with each other. And that can address this problem of isolation, because it is difficult to really build gratitude at work if employees aren't actually interacting with each other. The second obstacle to gratitude is employees who are disengaged. If employees are deeply disengaged from their work, then it's going to be difficult to build in gratitude. You need to, as a starting point, have employees who feel some sort of engagement and commitment to their work. Otherwise, you're much more likely to get cynical and even angry responses to any attempt to instill gratitude in the organization. One of my recommendations for helping engage employees is to build pride in the organization. So earlier I talked about problems with excessive hubristic pride for oneself, but pride in the organization is quite important. And so for instance, at Facebook, they did a study that found that the single biggest predictor of employee engagement was pride in the organization. And that pride in turn was predicted by 3 factors. The first was optimism, how much people believe in the company's future. The second was mission, how much do people care about the company's vision and goals. And the third was social good, so how confident are people that the company is making the world a better place. And so if we just think about some of these ways as we're trying to shift an organization's culture, how can we make employees feel more engaged? How can we make them feel prouder of the organization? This can be really effective. And then the final obstacle that I think we often need to overcome is this concern that management just isn't going to care. For many years, I focused my research on building more forgiving organizations, and this was a problem that I came across all the time. So managers would say, well, yeah, forgiveness is great, but I really don't think it's appropriate for the workplace. It seems kind of soft and squishy, and I don't feel like my employees would even respect me if I tried to talk about forgiveness at work. And so I've tried a few things to try to get people on board. And what I found is most effective is to emphasize the positive business effects. And so what I would say with forgiveness is, look, we know that good relationships and constructive conflict management matters for organizational effectiveness. And here's the data that clearly show that when people get along with each other at work, that work outcomes are more positive. Employees perform better, they're more satisfied, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I suggest for gratitude is to do the exact same thing. We already have a good bit of knowledge on the positive effects of gratitude at work. We know that more grateful workplaces produce more helping behavior. We know that there's less likelihood to be conflict and deviance at work when there's more gratitude. We know that we get stronger, more committed relationships when we bring gratitude into work, and that employees are going to be more oriented toward a positive social impact. And so if we can emphasize that and bring not just gratitude for its own sake, but really say, hey, and this is something that's going to have all sorts of benefits, it really is a win-win, that can be really effective. So that's it for me. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'll just say thank you. And anybody who would like to talk to me further, here's my email address, and I'm happy to reply to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing that. That was super powerful. And yeah, I think all our minds are pretty much blown by your share. So we are going to dive into the Q&A portion of this webinar for about a little under 15 minutes. So you guys have been submitting your questions to the chat box. I encourage you to continue doing so, and Hannah will be curating those live for us. I'm now going to share my screen with you all. So these are some questions that have been submitted by you guys ahead of time to our share today. And we have our first question that we're kicking off with are, what are the best practices in fostering gratitude that can be linked to a business result? Is there data associated with gratitude and business?
Um, sure. So I think that if we're trying to think about best practices for fostering gratitude that are going to be linked to business results, I really think that the key is thinking of gratitude as part of the organizational culture. And so if we just think of gratitude as something that's piecemeal, as something that's an individual level thing, then there are limits to sort of how effective gratitude can be. So we know that we need organizational level systems to have an organizational level impact. And so what I would say is if you want to really link things to business results, what we want to try to do is we want to try to say, what can we do to build an organizational system of gratitude? And that's why I think that organizational practices, HR practices like appreciation programs are so important. And in terms of the data, I do want to be clear that there is quite a bit of empirical data, especially with helping behavior. And especially with building higher quality relationships, we know that gratitude has these direct effects in organizations. We're not just inferring it from data from social psychology. So especially with helping behavior and high quality relationships, especially when gratitude is fostered as an organizational culture and system, we know we can have positive effects.
Wonderful. Another question that we had actually come in live during the Q&A was from Denise. And she asked, why is it that we are promoting gratitude in the workplace as opposed to compassion or love? What makes gratitude particularly special in a business context?
So I think passion is on compassion. So compassion being a response to somebody else's suffering, where we try to ameliorate that suffering, love as well. I come from this area of positive organizational scholarship where we believe that all of these things are valuable in organizations. So we believe that organizations are better off when they're more grateful, when they're more compassionate, when they're more forgiving. So I don't think that it needs to be an either or at all. And I think that we can actually view these things as connected. And if we do, we're going to be better off. And if we think that we can have all of these things at once. Now, what I'll say I think makes gratitude particularly powerful is that it's so relevant to so many aspects of work. So work is inherently interdependent. At work, we can't succeed without other people helping us and without working with other people. And those instances of interdependence and those instances of helping can go one of two ways. They can be reluctant and they can be transactional, or they can be grateful and they can be underlined by a really strong relationship. And so I think gratitude is something that we can apply to work every day. I think that gratitude is something that applies to pretty much all organizations. So it's not that these other things can't be effective. I do think they're effective, and I work on some of these areas myself as well. But gratitude is just something that I think is so widely applicable. That's one of the things that makes it powerful.
Another question that we had submitted ahead of time was, how might we tactically position gratitude so it's seen as an important part of a company's DNA?
So as an organizational scholar, one of the things we really believe in is the importance of tone from the top, the importance of sort of getting top management's buy-in and support for any program. So if we want gratitude to be seen as part of a company's DNA, what we are really talking about, again, is we want gratitude to be part of a company's culture. Here, it could be helpful to think that organizational culture has sort of two dimensions. One is formal and one is informal. So the first thing that we would want to do is we want to start with formal systems. So we can start instilling gratitude into a company's DNA by building appreciation programs, by building beneficiary contact, developmental feedback, putting formal systems in place that really help to create a more grateful organizational culture. And then from the bottom up, we want to try to build the informal side of an organization's culture. So that's when we want to build rituals and routines and sort of everyday informal interactions that support gratitude as well. And what we always find in organizational research is that a culture isn't going to succeed if we don't have both of those, if we don't have the formal systems as well as the informal systems. And so that means, for instance, that a leader can't just have a formal gratitude gratitude and encourage gratitude his or herself on a daily basis. So we need to have the formal systems, but then we need to have the informal, everyday, encouraging gratitude and building that into the organization to really be successful.
And another question that kind of sparks from that we've also received during the Q&A has been from Deborah, and she's asking, can you give some examples of types of implementation that you've seen, I guess, in the informal and the formal sectors from some of your work that involve gratitude and how that's been rolled out and who's been involved in that process?
Yeah, so I think I tend to think about gratitude programs as an HR system. And so I think a reasonable starting place is it's gonna depend on your organization's structure, but I think HR is a reasonable starting place. One of the things you can do is you can try to find an organizational ritual or routine that's already in place, and then you can try to attach gratitude to that. And that can be an effective starting point. So for instance, there's one example that I think is pretty interesting, where there's an organization that already had formal meetings that would occur something like once every month. And so what they would do is they would attach a moment of appreciation at the beginning of those meetings. And so at the beginning of the meeting, people would go around the room and talk about some of the things going on in the organization that they were grateful for. And perhaps at first people feel a little awkward about it, but over time and once people get used to it, it can be surprisingly powerful. And what I like about that is it's an easy first step, because you're already having these meetings anyway. You're only asking for a minute or two at the beginning, and it can be a good testing ground to just get a sense of the potential value of this, and it can be an effective way to get buy-in for a potentially broader system and a broader focus on gratitude.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Another question that we've received ahead of time was, at what point in an organization does gratitude become mission critical? Super interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm again reminded of the sort of metaphor comparison to social impact and CSR. So sometimes MBA students will ask me, all right, when is it really important to have CSR or to pay attention to ethics in an organization? So is it just when an organization is embroiled in a scandal, so now Wells Fargo needs to focus on ethics? It's become mission critical. And my reaction to that is usually that it's mission critical for every organization. And I think that it's similar here. So I would say that certainly, if you have an organization, getting back to the why gratitude questions that I had mentioned at the beginning, if you have an organization where it's clear that there's so much competition, unhealthy competition, where employees are fighting all the time, you have an organization where everything's about transactions, so people don't offer to help each other, nobody agrees to stay at work late. If you have an organization where people are so distracted and so overloaded that they just can't see the big picture about what's going on, then gratitude becomes more urgent. And so I definitely think it's more urgent in that context. But it's also important to remember that even in a healthy organization, gratitude can have very powerful effects, and gratitude can become a buffer to those problems. So remember, one of the consequences of gratitude that I talked about was organizational resilience. And if you have gratitude in place, it actively helps organizations deal with these problems when they come along. So if you get to a point where you're facing these external challenges, things are becoming more competitive and overloaded, gratitude, if it's already in place, can really help deal with those issues.
Wonderful. Another question that we've received was from Abby, and she asked, who has leverage in shaping organizational systems around gratitude? Who would that person be if you're trying to do that within your organization? Would that be something that falls under HR or something in the C-suite? Where would you encourage that activation to begin?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the organization. It's going to depend on its structure, et cetera. But if you're trying to think about sort of where to start, you can talk to your immediate supervisor. You can, what you might want to do is to try to just bring up the topic a little bit with different people in the organization. Talk to your boss, talk to your coworkers, talk to HR, and get a sense of where the interest is. And you might find that if you go with that interest, that's going to be effective. So maybe you find that a couple of your coworkers are the ones that are most interested in gratitude. And if that's the case, then you could build sort of a gratitude ritual within just that circle of employees that are really interested. But if you can get, for instance, HR's support, and you can get support for an actual company-wide program, then that's great. And then you can try to bring more people on board to help support you in that effort of building an HR program focused on gratitude. So what I would encourage you to do as a starting point is to sort of find the allies in the process and find the people that are really sort of excited about this. And then once you have that critical mass, then you can find that best path to institute some of these systems.
Wonderful. And that's something that has definitely come up over the course of the challenge as well, is the question of these small group interactions and the impact of those,
Yeah.
and also how the scaling process may or may not factor into what the long-term impact of that looks like within an organization. So I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Wonderful. Another question is, gratitude often requires a behavioral change, especially for those in senior positions, to set the tone within a company. Are there any examples of approaches that have been successful in achieving this? I feel like you've touched on this, but maybe pulling in some specific examples that you've observed.
So gratitude often requires a behavioral change, especially those in senior positions. Right. And so if I think about this idea that it requires a behavioral change, one way to sort of interpret this question is we have leaders who need to change their behavior to start setting this tone. And so I think that the approach that is most successful here is the one that I mentioned about saying that there are really these positive business effects for gratitude. So we need our leaders to not just say, oh, sure, that sounds great, and then go on with their daily lives. They really need to believe that this is going to be a positive thing for the organization. And so the most successful path that I've seen for really getting leadership on board and really getting them to set the tone with formal and informal practices with any positive organizational intervention. So interventions around gratitude, interventions around forgiveness, around compassion, is to say that this is going to be something that's going to make the organization more successful. And right now we have a false belief that a successful organization is one that's competitive, it's one that's transactional, and that things like gratitude, compassion, et cetera, are not for the workplace. And so we need to change that mentality, and we have data to do that, and then that's what's really going to behavioral changes to actively work toward changing the tone in the organization.
Another question that's emerged from this conversation that has, again, come up on the platform as well, has been about designing for gratitude in different cultural contexts. You mentioned that you were doing a project with a factory in China. So I'm wondering, taking into account the very different cultural interpretations and cultural nuances of gratitude, how do you factor those in when you are going to implement a gratitude-oriented solution in a different cultural context than your own?
Right, and so I think that often for that, the devil is in the details, so to speak. And so what I've done, for instance, in this project that I'm doing in China right now, is I set up the overall framework where I say, look, what we want to do is we want to try to encourage gratitude expression within the organization. We want to try to get employees to express gratitude to each other, let's say once a week. And then what I do is I make sure that I have allies that are in that company. So for this project in China, I'm partnering with a consultant in China who's going into the company, is actually instituting this gratitude intervention. And so what he is doing right now is he is setting up the way that this program is implemented to ensure that it's sensitive to the norms of the organization. Right. So he's focusing on some of the unique challenges that they're facing there. And so I think just my main recommendation here is that when you're working in a different cultural context, start by talking at a high level about what you're trying to accomplish, and then allow those allies who are familiar with that other cultural context to help set up the details in a way that's sensitive to the way things are done in that organization. I think that if I just translated the way I do a gratitude expression intervention here and then just tried to implement it in China, I don't think it would work. But by bringing on these other folks, they're able to kind of shift things in a way that's appropriate for that context.
Wonderful. Amazing. Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking conversation, and also to our community for engaging so deeply in this topic and being super engaged and sharing all of your questions for this webinar. So before we conclude today, I would like to remind you all that we are in the ideas phase of the challenge. So following this, you can feel free to visit our platform at openideo.com and participate. I think that Ryan's provided wonderful context to sculpt some of your ideas, and also consider posting your idea as a starting point. There can be refining that and mentorship to build out your idea over the course of the challenge, but we really encourage you to at least get something on our platform. And as you should take into consideration, building out your ideas would be the evaluation criteria that we do have for ideas that we're particularly excited to see on the challenge. The first is that these ideas are internal and they should be designed for internal implementation within organizations. Secondly, that these ideas inspire authentic and true, meaningful expressions of gratitude rather than mandating them. And lastly, that these ideas are systemic, considering the complexities of organizational structures and experiences, and design solutions that can be implemented systems-wide. And Ryan, thank you so much again for joining us today and providing a richness of information for us to draw from when creating our ideas for this platform. So thank you all. And we will be sending out a recording of this entire session to all of you, and you can feel free to share that with your networks as well. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.